Should I be able to hear the music?
Don, there's no sound. You're on mute.
Sound, please. Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to day 5 in our series Children's Mental Health Week. For those who don't know, my name is Judy Clements, and I'm the Director for Children's Ministries here in the South England Conference. And my co-host is Tembi, and she is going to pray for us now. Tembi?
A warm welcome indeed. Let us pray. Father, this evening, we just want to say thank you once again for the privilege of serving you tonight as we present another program. We pray that, Lord, everything will go smoothly, that you will be with our speakers, Serena and Edith, that you will be with each and every family that is watching tonight, and that the program will be beneficial to all for your glory. For we pray in Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you. And for those who have joined us, I would just like to acknowledge our South England Conference President, Dr. Emmanuel Osei, who has joined us this evening. Good evening and a very warm welcome to you, Dr. Osei. We're delighted that you're able to join us on day 5. Day 5 this evening, we are looking at the topic of children with learning difficulties. It's a subject that we believe is not addressed often enough, particularly in our minority ethnic communities. And we have 2 very experienced speakers tonight, highly professional in their field. First, we have Serena Decordova, who's an educational consultant offering private tuition to small group classes. Serena is a qualified primary school teacher with over 10 years experience in the independent sector. And as head of inclusion and enrichment in her previous role, she was responsible for managing the provision for children requiring additional academic stretch. Before joining the education sector, Serena enjoyed a decade working in the not-for-profit sector, championing the rights of children and racial equality. She holds a PGCE with distinction from Canterbury Christchurch University and a postgraduate diploma in law, as well as a BA in international relations and politics. She lives here, in fact, not far from me in South London with her husband and 2 children. She enjoys walking and writing, and she's currently working on her first middle grade children's novel. Welcome, Serena. Serena is also joined by Edith Samambwa. Edith is highly qualified in her field and is a practicing occupational therapist in the mental health sector and a coach, speaker, and entrepreneur. She's worked for the Health Service Executive in Ireland for 13 years and was the Health Ministry's sponsor for the Irish Mission from 2008 to 2016. She completed her Master's in Public Health from the University College Dublin in 2007, and her research focus was on suicide prevention among men. She has been a lecturer at Limerick University in Ireland and at the University of Zimbabwe. Edith has over 2 decades of experience in the wellness industry, working in Zimbabwe, Ireland, and for the United Kingdom government. She also has experience more international experience in religious institutions, including the United Nations Development Fund for Women. And while working in Zimbabwe in the late 90s, she wrote and co-produced and presented a weekly radio program on emotional wellness and the then ZBC Radio 1. So Serena and Edith, welcome. Your credentials go before you, and we're looking forward to your presentations this evening. The floor is now yours.
And thank you very much, Judy, for that kind and generous welcome and introduction. And thank you everyone for joining us this evening. I'm going to get straight on and share my presentation with you. If you have any questions or comments, please do pop them into the chat, and Edith and I will try and address them as we go along or at the end if we don't make it to your question or comment. And yeah, we hope this will be an interactive evening, so don't be shy. I've been admitting people in. Is Don, are you going to be able to do that now? Somebody else will do it, yeah? Okay.
We've got that in hand, don't worry.
So special educational needs and disabilities, I think for me as a practitioner, as a professional, I think children need to be at the center of it all. I think the whole issue of special educational needs or learning difficulties can be really sensitive for everybody involved, for the parent, for the children, for the teachers. Parents worry. You know, they worry that they've done something wrong. They sometimes blame themselves. They question what they could have done differently, and they worry. But the important thing to remember is it's, you know, parents are important, but the most important people in the room are the children themselves. And we owe them a duty of care to make sure that, you know, they get all the support and obviously the love and nurturing and patience that they deserve, because, you know, living with a child with any kind of additional need, teaching a child with an additional need, any kind of responsibility you have for children with extra needs, it can be challenging and it can test your patience. And, you know, I understand that, lots of people understand that, but also as a community, we have to understand that. We have to be able to think about what role can we play to maybe alleviate some of the challenges that parents might face. What are we talking about when we talk about special educational needs? Well, it's defined in the Code of Practice, and there's a review pending, and so we may get, you know, a revised Code of Practice. But, you know, this government is very busy with lots of other things, so there may well be a delay with this, but this Special Educational Needs Code of Practice is under review. So a child does have needs or learning needs if they're considered to be sort of learning at a different pace to others. They're not making the progress that the other children in the classroom might be making. And any kind of special educational provision that's put in place is anything that's different to address the need. Now, we might have additional support, which is slightly different to special educational provision, because with additional support, what you're looking at is maybe a TA in the classroom who might touch base with a child, but wouldn't necessarily be addressing a particular need. It's not something that's persistent. So the Code of Practice outlines a variety of areas, 6 main areas. Children can have general learning difficulties. They may struggle with communication and interaction, emotional, social, and mental health, a specific learning difficulty like dyslexia or dyspraxia, challenges with speech and language, or difficulties with physical, that might be their growth, their fine motor. You might have hearing impairment, sight impairments. There's a whole range of needs. So in the school, in the classroom environment, this might be picked up. Teachers might notice that, as I mentioned before, there might be slow progress, and hopefully most schools should be regularly checking children's progress through testing and observations and teacher judgment. Obviously, the pandemic has had an enormous impact on this, with some children not receiving appropriate educational provision, some children may be slipping through the gaps. But just because a child isn't making progress doesn't necessarily mean there is a special educational need. And this is where, teacher observations, monitoring, and special interventions need to be put in place to check whether the child makes progress. And usually a child will make progress with an intervention if there isn't a special educational need. It's not always clear cut. You can still have a special educational need and be a high achiever. You might have a condition, you might have autism. You might have dyslexia. It's not always very clear what's happening. And girls are very adept at masking and assimilating in the classroom. And so boys are very easy to diagnose in some senses. It's very clear when a boy has a special educational need, such as autism, but it's less so for girls. And what happens is there's an under-diagnosis for girls, and that can lead to challenges later on. So I guess my advice to you would be, as a parent, if you have a slight niggle or concern about your child, don't shy away from speaking to your GP, speaking to teachers, and just seeking another opinion. Some children really excel in one area of their learning, but yet will struggle in another. So you might have a child who is fantastic at math, but reading and literacy-based activities are a real challenge. They might have dyslexia. You may have a very high achiever, again, in maths and literacy, but because of their autism, they're struggling to engage in the playground. They might really struggle with classroom discussions and debates. So as a parent, what might you expect to happen in school? If a teacher suspects there's a concern, they'll most likely raise it with the SENCO, Special Educational Needs Coordinator. They'll talk to them about what concerns they have. They'll present the child's attainment, look at their behaviour, their attendance, and they'll monitor this for a bit, but then they will, or they most likely, they really should, inform you as a parent. Now, there's a phrase that there should be high quality teaching and that every child is entitled to receive that quality first teaching, high quality teaching that should really cover all bases and should only impact on children if they have a special educational need. But we know teachers are only human and not all teachers are perfect, unfortunately. So they may not always get access to high quality teaching. Some teachers may not differentiate appropriately. And what that means is you provide for the range of academic ability in your classroom. So all children will be doing fractions, but some children will be able to work at a higher level than other children. Some children might need, further resources or what they call reasonable adjustments in order to be able to access the learning that's taking place. And so teachers and special educational needs coordinators will work closely together to gather evidence whenever they suspect that there is an underlying issue that is impacting on the child's academic process or in relation to their social development or their emotional well-being in the school. What's really, really important, and this is just a little example, is that once it's decided that the child should perhaps go on the special educational needs register, that a conversation takes place with the child, that they get to have a say about what things they struggle with, what they find tricky, what they find difficult, what's important to them, what people like and admire about them, and what their aspirations are. And what we have to do is not lower our aspirations or expectations with children who have a special educational need. We should think about how can we make this accessible to them? How can we make their dreams and aspirations possible? Because they can really go on to do great things. The other thing is that the self-esteem, and this is really important, especially with Children's Mental Health Week, the self-esteem of children with special educational needs can be, really low at some points, especially if they're not progressing in the classroom. They begin to compare themselves with their peers. They realize that they're a bit different. They realize they're not grasping things perhaps as quickly. Perhaps they're struggling to maintain concentration during the lesson, or they're not getting all the instruction from the teacher. They miss things and they begin to sort of doubt their abilities, and they can dip very, very low. Again, this is why it's really important when we think about the language we use as parents, and parenting is not easy. I'm not criticizing my children, but parenting is not easy. It's a challenge for us all. Of course, we're only human. And so sometimes we want our children to just sit down and listen, or we want them to sit down and get on with their homework, not spend hours, looking over a comprehension. Do it quickly, do it diligently, write neatly, hold your pencil properly. All these things that we expect our children to be able to do. But sometimes it's not that they're defiant. Sometimes it's because they can't. And so that's why it's really important to keep those channels of communication open, so children feel that home is a safe space where they can tell us how they really feel without worry, without judgment, and without fear. I think we've got a question. I can't see everybody on the screen. I saw Redmi raised hand. So if you can unmute yourself and say your question or put it in the chat.
Do we have a question at this point? Anyone? I would just continue, Serena.
Okay. Do you put it in the chat? And then when I've stopped sharing, I'll be able to see everybody.
Serena?
Hello.
Perhaps I can just ask a question. It seems as though one ought to be trained teach children who have special needs. I'm wondering, within our church settings, our Sabbath school class, those who lead out may not necessarily have that skill. And we have those children. I mean, they go to our church schools, and so we may find them right there in church as well. Some of their behavior might indicate that, well, there is a special need here. I wonder how best for us to deal with a situation like that. Would you suggest that this
I think
training be, and maybe those in our Sabbath school, parents who teach Sabbath school, for instance?
I think it would be beneficial for them to receive some training, first of all, to raise awareness about the children that they have coming before them, and also to equip them with some strategies and techniques to help them when they're running their sessions. And depending on, the children that they have, thinking about how they might be able to adjust what they're delivering, week by week. And of course, I hadn't considered this, but perhaps in the same way that schools would have an individual education program for the child, which would outline, what adjustments need to be made in the classroom, what things they might struggle with, to have that open dialogue with parents bringing their children, to say, well, it might be a form that they fill in. Does your child have special educational needs? What adjustments are made for them in school? What do you think we need to do here to cater to their needs. I think that would be a brilliant way forward.
Serena, I have another question.
Yeah.
And this is from Heather, who says, as a parent of a child with SEN, being autistic and having ADHD, what I've found difficult is getting understanding for my son, because he's academically very able. And now, as a current third-year psychology student, she says, I'm hoping to complete SEN teacher training following my degree. So this webinar is extremely helpful from all angles. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think the thing is, with this normal teacher training, you know, there's a module on special educational needs, but it's not in great depth. And certainly when I entered the teaching profession, you know, I don't actually say I knew nothing about special educational needs, and learning on the job, you know, has been, I think I've been fortunate. I've been very blessed to be privileged to work with the range of children that I've had the opportunity to work with, because you learn such a lot from them. And if you're willing to really, you know, get down to their level and listen to their needs, you know, it will help you in terms of how you deliver and provide to other children. And I think in terms of thinking about children who attend the church schools, thinking about how do we have that dialogue with them, maybe on an individual basis, maybe with them and their parents, so that they have a chance to shape the provision. And, you know, it will be richly enhanced for that, I think. So there is a fear factor as well. So some parents, they recognize that their child's behavior is not typical. They might not know why. And for some parents, they deny. They say, I can see it's not typical. I know there's something wrong, but I can't face that. That's one thing. The other thing is, I don't want my child to be labeled. And especially for not to generalize, but the history of special educational needs within the UK, and how, you know, children were classed as substandard. There's a baggage that we carry as Black people that we don't want necessarily perhaps for our children to be labelled and assessed, because we think the colour of their skin is a barrier for them already, and we don't want to add anything else. We don't want to burden them. And I completely understand that. But again, that's our baggage as adults. It's not the child's baggage. And what we have to do is, actually, we have to give them the very best chance possible. And early intervention is absolutely the best thing to do. Because once you know what the child is, you know, what the underlying reason is, then you can hopefully get a different level of understanding from the educational environment. And also schools have a legal duty then to provide and deal with your child appropriately. Because I guess for some of the conditions that children have, or some of the challenges that they face, they may manifest in behavioural difficulties. So it might be that they struggle to sit and listen in class, or they may have emotional challenges and then they lash out maybe at other children, or they have meltdowns and anger outbursts. And this behaviour can be deemed inappropriate by schools, and we find that children then end up being excluded when actually what they needed was support and intervention. So partnership, cooperation, and collaboration is important. Now, sometimes you have a situation where the parent has a niggle, but the school doesn't believe it. The school doesn't think there's a problem. So there's a parent I'm working with at the moment. And what's happening is the child at home wakes up in the morning and doesn't want to go to school. The child has autism, Asperger's, and there's some anxiety there as well. Doesn't feel that school is a safe place. And so really lashes out at his parents in the morning. When he does eventually get to school, although the transition is difficult, he doesn't display the behavior that he's showing at home. But every little thing, what we might deem to be little. So if a teacher says to him, you can't go to the toilet, if a child takes his pencil, if somebody bumps into him, it's almost as if his cup is filling up throughout the day and he stores all that, every negative experience up. And when he gets home, it all comes out, it all pours out. But the school is not prioritizing this because they're not seeing it. So sometimes parents do have a challenge to convince the school that there's something going on and that support is needed. What you have to do is you have to be persistent. And as parents, you are your child's most loyal and strongest advocate. And sometimes it's a little walk in the park and you have to fight for what your child needs, but it will be worth it. It will be exhausting, but there is support out there. You will need the community around you. You will need your family support to help you. There'll be lots of forms to fill out, lots of meetings, but it's absolutely the most important thing to do, to be persistent and challenge where you feel that the doors are closed. So schools, some teachers are a bit reluctant to say to a parent that their child has a need because they know how sensitive it is. And you know, when your child is born, you don't think, oh, they're going to have a special educational need. But I think we also have to destigmatize and demystify these things. So children may have challenges with their behavior, their ability to socialize, reading and writing, understanding, comprehending the work that they're presented with, their concentration levels, you know, might not be great. They might struggle physically. These are all the types of barriers that they can have with their learning. So a child may have a special educational need, but may not have such a severe need that they need an education, health and care plan. Now, these education, health and care plans were formerly known as statements. And so a child needs an education and health and care plan where the different professions come together and work out what support that child needs. They might need adjustments to be made in school. They may need input from an occupational health therapist. And we're going to hear from Edith a bit later about the work that she does to support children. Some children just need a bit of extra help in the classroom. Some need to go out into small groups. Others may need a speech and language therapist to come into school, or they may need to go out and see their occupational therapist, or the occupational therapist may need to develop a program that they have to complete whilst they're in school and at home. There's a range of support that's available. But whatever's decided, schools and parents really need to work together, and that's where things will be most effective, where there's a really good partnership. Schools and parents may not always agree, but the communication channels must be kept open. Now, not all schools will necessarily have a special educational needs register. They should, but there's no legal requirement for them to have one, but it's a very useful tool. And, you know, most schools do have them, but they don't have to. They don't need parent permission to put the child on the special educational needs register. They must communicate it. And again, some parents don't want their child on there because of the stigma, they fear the labeling. But really, it's just a way of helping the school to monitor what support they've put in place and what interventions are there, and then also to monitor progress, whether things are making an impact and being effective. And sometimes you find that a child who's had lots of, you know, very well delivered intervention at a younger age can develop strategies so that they can manage their special educational need as they progress through their educational career. And so the additional support and interventions are no longer needed. And I mentioned before a little earlier about additional needs register. So you can have a range of additional needs. It might be a medical need, English as an additional language, and you might need access arrangements, due to a sight impairment. But this wouldn't necessarily be classed as a special educational need. And then, of course, if the school feels that the intervention has worked, they do have to inform parents if they're going to take the child off the register. And so if you've got that good relationship going, hopefully that will happen, quite seamlessly. I mean, there is something to note that SENCOs are notoriously overworked and underpaid. So, be forgiving of them if something slips. It's not, that they're neglectful of your child. It's probably just a workload issue. Okay. And again, some parents might fear that if they remove their child from the register, that their child will no longer get the support that they need. Again, just be open and honest about your concerns and fears and see if you can come to some agreement with the school, should that be the case. So just going to go into a bit more detail about some of the conditions. And I was given this book by a parent I worked with. I was working with their child, and they gave me this book, and the book's been turned into a documentary, a film. And it was written by a 13-year-old boy with autism, very high functioning. And what he tried to do is put into words what it was like to be an autistic boy, to be 13 years old and have autism. So I'm just going to read a couple of pages here. I think, they were quite powerful when I read them. Imagine a daily life in which your faculty of speech is taken away. Explaining that you're hungry or tired or in pain is now as beyond your powers as a chat with a friend. I'd like to push the thought experiment a little further. Now imagine that after you lose your ability to communicate, the editor in residence who orders your thoughts walks out without notice. The chances are that you never knew this mind editor existed, but now that he or she has gone, you realize too late how they allowed your mind to function for all these years. A dam burst of ideas, memories, impulses, and thoughts is cascading over you unstoppably. Your editor controlled this flow, diverting the vast majority away and recommending just a tiny number for your conscious consideration. But now you're on your own. Now your mind is a room where 20 radios, all tuned to different stations, are blaring out voices and music. The radios have no off switches or volume controls. The room you're in has no door or window, and relief will come only when you're too exhausted to stay awake. To make matters worse, another hitherto unrecognized editor has just quit without notice. Your editor of the senses. Suddenly, sensory input from your environment is flooding into, unfiltered in quality and overwhelming in quantity. Colors and patterns swim and clamor for your attention. The fabric conditioner in your sweater smells as strong as air freshener fired up your nostrils. Your comfy jeans are now as scratchy as steel wool. Your vestibular and proprioceptive senses are also out of kilter, so the floor keeps tilting like a ferry in heavy seas, and you're no longer sure where your hands and feet are in relation to the rest of you. You can feel the plates of your skull, plus your facial muscles and your jaw. Your head feels trapped inside a motorbike helmet, 3 sizes too small, which may or may not explain why the air conditioner is as deafening as an electric drill. But your father, who, right here in front of you, sounds as if he's speaking to you from a cell phone on a train, going through lots of short tunnels in fluent Cantonese. You are no longer able to comprehend your mother tongue, or any tongue. From now on, all languages will be foreign languages. Even your sense of time has gone. rendering you unable to distinguish between a minute and an hour, as if you've been entombed in an Emily Dickinson poem about eternity or locked into a time-bending science fiction film. Poems and films, however, come to an end, whereas this is your new ongoing reality. Autism is a lifelong condition. So, signs of autism in young children. They may not respond to their name. They may avoid eye contact. They might not like to smile. They can become very upset if they don't like a certain taste, smell, or sound. You might see them do repetitive body movements, such as flapping their hands or flicking their fingers or rocking their body. They may not talk as much as other children, or they might hang on to phrases and repeat them over and over again. They can sometimes seem to struggle to understand what others think or feel, and they might find it tricky to say how they feel. Some children with autism do like a strict daily routine and can get very upset if it changes, or they might have a very keen interest in certain subjects. So a boy I was working with a couple of years ago loved flags. Another boy loved trains. They might respond quite negatively if you ask them to do something, and making friends can be a challenge. And sometimes they can take things very literally. So they might not understand a phrase like break a leg. Autism, as I mentioned before, can manifest differently in boys and girls. And autistic girls may appear to be quieter, hide their feelings, and may appear to cope better with social situations, but inside they can be in turmoil. So, Dom, I wondered if we could play the first video.
Autism is a lifelong disability which affects how people, like me, communicate and interact with the world. There are about 700,000 adults and children on the autism spectrum in the UK. And like everyone, each autistic person has their own strengths and challenges. But all of us have difficulties with communicating and interacting with other people. This could mean not speaking at all, needing longer to process information, or not understanding facial expressions. We also engage in repetitive behaviour, doing or thinking the same thing over and over. This is sometimes for fun, and sometimes to help deal with our anxiety. People on the autism spectrum can also find unexpected changes, however small, very distressing. And then there is sensory overload, where noise, smells, touch, and bright lights become very painful and overwhelming. All these challenges can make the world feel very scary and hard to understand, and sometimes send us into physical and emotional meltdowns or shutdowns. It is very important that autistic people get help from an early age. But life can become very difficult if children or adults don't get the right support or understanding. Autistic children are 3 times more likely to be excluded from school. Only 1 in 6 autistic people in the UK have a full-time job. And over 1/3 of autistic adults have reported serious mental health problems. The National Autistic Society is the UK's leading charity for autistic people. Since 1962, we have been changing society's attitudes and transforming individuals' lives. We want to create a society that works for autistic adults and children, and with your help, we can.
Thanks, Dom. Can we play the second video as well, please?
This video is a really quick introduction to PDA.
Autism is dimensional.
This means that it varies a lot from one person to another.
A PDA profile describes one way in which autism can present.
With PDA, it demands of all types,
including lots of things that you might not think of as a demand.
Can trigger an automatic threat or anxiety response.
And a feeling of panic can rapidly set in.
Demand avoidance in PDA is a question of can't, not won't.
PDAers often describe it as a neurological tug-of-war between brain, heart and body.
Also, the approaches that help can seem a bit unconventional.
A partnership based on trust, flexibility, collaboration, careful use of language and balancing of demands works best.
Because PDA is often missed, misunderstood or misdiagnosed.
It's important for all of us to have PDA on our radar.
To find out more, please see our website.
Thank you, Dom. Okay, so there are lots of different conditions that children can experience. Autism is one of them, and for some children, they can coexist. So they may not just have autism, they may also have, ADHD. They may have sensory integration issues. And Edith, I'm going to bring Edith in a second to talk about that. So it's just important for us to be aware that it's not always clear cut. It may not be one thing, it may be multiple challenges for some children, and children can have what professionals would describe as a spiky profile, lots of things going on. So for children with attention deficit or hyperactivity disorder, you can have, some children experience it where they are hyperactive or they may have lower energies. It may appear they may seem inactive or inattentive. If you do have concerns about this, again, speak to your child's teacher, speak to the SENCO, speak to your GP. With lots of special educational needs and learning difficulties, there's lots of research still happening. We don't know the full causes of these conditions. Sometimes things run in families, sometimes they don't. And I guess as research continues, we're getting to understand a bit better, what the neurodiverse landscape looks like. So I think I mentioned right at the beginning the importance of patience and children feeling safe. And I think in the last video it mentioned that it's not sometimes that children won't, but that they can't. So, you might have children who come into church and struggle to sit down. They might be a bit disruptive to the service. What can we do? What can we do differently? How can we accommodate these needs? Are there safe spaces that we can create within our community, within our churches, where, a child, with autism or a child with sensory processing disorder could still spend time in the church, but maybe in a tent, somewhere they could feel safe. Maybe they might need a weighted blanket. They might need to wear some ear defenders. What adjustments can we put in place to support children? Parents can usually tell when their children's behavior isn't typical. Again, it's just deciding between action or inaction and what's holding us back from seeking support or seeking advice and help. And sometimes the judgment could come from within your own family. Your judgment might be about your parenting, or you're not disciplining your child, Or, you know, I remember at the school I worked at before, we suggested that, you know, there's a child who was really sort of picking his skin, and we suggested to the mother that he might need some counselling and therapeutic input. And she said, yeah, but my mum and dad won't like me doing that. You know, so she wasn't getting support for her child because her parents wouldn't want her to. When a child does have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, it can be treated with medication. But also, I've seen children who have had fantastic occupational therapy input, and it's made a world of difference to them. And for parents who are parenting children with these needs, life can be pretty tough. So it will impact on the amount of sleep you get, the stress levels when trying to get them ready for school, just trying to get them to look after their belongings, getting them organized, being able to participate in social occasions, or even just going shopping can be quite a challenge. So if you notice somebody whose child has a challenge within your community, maybe think about how you might be able to support and help them. Can you establish some kind of support network from within your local church? And we shouldn't underestimate the impact on children's self-esteem. You know, I mentioned earlier that as children become more aware and older, they begin to compare themselves to their peers, and they really doubt themselves and can dip very low. So it's just really celebrating who they are and sort of recognizing, you know, these challenges, these barriers as actually their superpower, looking at celebrating their difference and making them feel good about themselves. It's really important. There are so many challenges out there in wider society that, you know, we really have to give children these safe spaces. Again, this just talks about what can happen with teenagers who have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and that it can lead to anxiety, depression, sleep problems as they enter their teenage years. Again, I can't emphasize enough, early intervention is crucial. It's not the easiest actually as well. That's also true to say. You can, if you go for an assessment with CAMS, you can be on the waiting list for a very long time. So again, another nudge to get them on the list early. You can seek private assessment if you have the financial capacity to do so, but it is very expensive. So it might not be an option for everybody. Okay, so dyslexia, it impacts with their literacy, writing, spelling, activities. I won't go into too much detail because I noticed the time is ticking and I want us to get on to Edith. So I can send these slides or, you know, share them via Judy. One of the things you can do if you do have a child with dyslexia, whilst they'll need extra additional support from school, just, you know, read to them as much as you can, so that they can develop that vocabulary, they can develop that love of stories. You know, audio books are very good. But also just sharing books with their parents is just brilliant. And this is just an organisation who can provide additional support to parents whose children have special educational needs. So if you are concerned about your child, or your child already has a diagnosis and you're not already in touch with them, do take a note of their name and get in touch. They can provide lots of different support and advice. So I thought I'd introduce a case study and then hand over to Edith. So X, or I'll call him Zane. Zane is 8 years old. He struggles to follow sequential instructions. He loses his belongings all the time at home and at school. He can't keep his room tidy. He can't sit up straight at the table. He's constantly slouching or leaning to one side or just completely flat on the table. He's a confident reader, although he's very easily distracted when either in a whole learning situation in the classroom or even one-to-one. He'll constantly say to his tutor, "Did you hear that noise?" complains of pain in his hands whenever he writes. He doesn't like loud noises, finds it tricky to get dressed, struggles with doing his buttons up, and he fusses or complains about certain fabrics on his skin because they make him feel really uncomfortable. So Edith, as our occupational therapist in chief, can you tell me what's going on with Zane? And can you tell us a little bit more about the work that you do? I'm going to stop sharing here.
Okay, thank you so much, Serena. You put me on the spot, but it's all good. It's all good. So I know many of us may have seen some of these behaviors and maybe even have experienced them in ourselves and maybe some of and our children. And I think it's those are very important questions for us to have. So what could be possibly happening with this child, an 8-year-old with all these symptoms? Now, you spoke about a few things in your presentation earlier about dyspraxia. We spoke about sensory integration issues that a child might have. And you also spoke a little bit about, of course, about ADHD. My guess would be this young man is suffering or has probably dyspraxia and some sensory integration issues. And you can tell that from the difficulties they have with textures, with touch, and also with noises. So that would be my best guess.
Thank you so much. So Edith, do you want to tell us a bit more about your experience and some of the work you do with children as an occupational therapist? I know that you yourself, when you were younger, you had undiagnosed needs initially.
Awesome.
But yeah,
okay.
I wondered if you were happy to share
Sure.
about your personal experience, to give that testimony, and so that we haven't got any children here to share their voices, but perhaps you could share that with us if you're happy to.
All right, thank you so much. And I am going to be the child in the room, and I believe myself to be an eternal teenager anyhow, but I will share with you my experience, and I'm going to take you back. Thank you, Judy, for that introduction. For those of you that missed the introduction, this might not make too much sense for you. I wish you had been there at the beginning, but for those of you that were there at the beginning, you'll be able to contrast the Edith that you heard about, and so and in that picture that Judy was able to tell all of you, and also be able to see the Edith that I used to be years ago. And I want to take you back to 1983. And in 1983, I was in 4th grade. I found myself at a new school, and I'm going to tell you this story because I want you to put everything together, what Serena spoke about in terms of just learning challenges that children might have and sensory challenges that they may have. I would like you to see the bigger picture. Like you to see what is possibly happening when also it's not a learning challenge, right, or a learning difficulty. So my story is hopefully going to illustrate that to you. So I'll take you back to 1983. I don't remember what the music was. I always remember things in music always remember. I think Madonna was singing Holiday or something like that that year. I was in 4th grade. And I finished that year bottom of the class. I finished that year in this, it was very dismal for me. And when I went into 5th grade in 1984, I was placed in the special needs class. I was placed in what was called 5E. So I was in 5th grade and I was in 5E. Now I remember sitting in this class and just thinking to myself, this is not the clever kids class. I sat there for 3 days and I thought to myself, I don't belong here. This is not where I'm supposed to be. And I don't know why I had that intuition, but I understood it. And I looked around and I saw what we were learning as well. And I say to myself, I don't need to be in this place. I don't need to be in this class. Now, obviously, in the school system in Zimbabwe that we were raised in, I had been streamed according to my results the previous year and my academic performance. Now, if you just took my academic performance without everything else that had been happening in my life, you would have been like, yep, she is definitely learning disabled. She has probably a mild learning disorder or even more than that. But if I take you back a previous year to 1983 or the end of 1982, and just paint a picture of what was happening to my young life at that time. So at this point, I'm 8 years old, and I had been living with my grandmother for the last 8 years, maybe 7 years. And suddenly I was wrenched from my grandmother's care, who my grandmother had developed cancer at that time. And I had to go and live about 300-400 miles away from where we normally lived, where I had grown up, and live with my grandmother there with total strangers. Now, these total strangers were my uncle and his wife, my mother's brother, but they were strangers to me, because I'd not lived with them. I hardly knew them. So I'm living with these people. Also, we're in a different language. I'm in the southern part of Zimbabwe. Now, I had been in the northern part where we speak Shona, and I'm brought into the southern part in Bulawayo where you speak Ndebele, right? So I've got a language issue going on. Most of the people around me, besides English, don't speak the language that I speak, or I don't speak the language that they speak. I'm in a new school because I couldn't go to a school that was close to where we lived. I had to walk an hour to school. And remember this, I'm 8 or 9 years of age. So I'm walking an hour to school. And I had somebody who used to take me halfway to school. My uncle used to take me halfway to school, and then I'd walk the rest of the way. Now, in this particular school, because one, I was different. I didn't speak the language. Number two, I was smaller than the other kids. I was chubbier as well than the other children. I was bullied every single day. For me, fourth grade was survival mode. I was not learning anything. I was trying to stay alive. And the one thing that was very clear in our household was you didn't fight. You didn't get into a fight. You didn't come home with your clothes torn or anything like that. So I had to do my best to avoid being hit and avoid fighting anyone who invited me to a fight, which was something that was happening all the time. So I found myself in this situation and not being in the normal environment or in an environment that was conducive for learning. I literally finished bottom of that class. And so when I moved to the following year to the school that was nearer home in a different environment, which was more nourishing, things were different. But when I got there, I was classified learning disabled. And on top of it all, and I want to share my slide with you, I want to share my slides with you just in a minute so you can sort of understand a little bit. On top of it all, I had dyspraxia. Now, some of you may not know that. I know there are a few of my friends here who are with us this evening. I had dyspraxia. I was that child that broke everything in the house. Literally, nobody knew why. Nobody knew and understood why I was so clumsy. I broke all the plates, all the china. Every time I walked into someone, they dropped what they had, or I dropped what I had on me. And it was so bad. Now, many of us have played this game. Who remembers playing this game? Hands up if you remember playing this game. Right? I can't see your hands, but I know that there's some of you that played this game as children, right? Now, look at that little girl in the middle. Now, picture that as me. Why? Because she's looking at, what do I do next? Now, this was me. I used to stand there in the middle of this game, hopscotch, and any other game that required coordination, and think to myself, which leg goes next? If I tried to play football, I had 2 left feet. Literally, I would have to think about which leg is kicking the ball. If someone kicks a ball at me, I would have to be wondering, do I use my right or do I use my left leg? So for some of you, this is not, I know some of you may play football, some of you females may play football as well, but I was one of those people that was just like, no, I am not doing this. I'm not even catching a ball. I am not playing netball because I had what they called butterfingers. So all these labels are being thrown at me, right? And this is sometimes what is happening around us. The kids that you're seeing, your children, they have these labels, butterfingers, clumsy. What's wrong with you? Why can't you hold the ball? Why can't you be like the other kids? I couldn't be like the other children. I couldn't. I would look at things and they didn't make sense to me. And on top of it all, when I played in sand, it was like something was happening. I would walk in sand or I'd walk in grass, and I just could not stand that. It was as if there was a pain. And even today, I was saying to Serena yesterday that even today, when I look at sand, something happens in my head. I'm like, no, I'm not going to do that. Now I have gone to the beach. I've walked to the beach. I've walked on grass. But obviously something progressed and changed. And that's something that Serena was mentioning earlier, and I was making notes as you were writing, that it's also important to know that these things can shift and they can change. But as a child, playing anything that needed coordination, sand, grass, sometimes textures, I didn't like anything rough on my skin. And on top of it all, I had all sorts of allergies going on. Sometimes I'd wake up in the morning and my eyes are swollen. So I missed school a lot, especially in 5th grade and 6th grade. I went for different tests and they couldn't figure out what was wrong with me. So I was, you could safely say, a difficult child. I was one of those children that if I was your child, you'd be like, why do I have to have all this going on? So in 5th grade, I found myself with all these challenges from a learning perspective, from a social perspective, from a sensory perspective, dyspraxia, all those things, you name it. Now, if you heard my introduction earlier, you'd be wondering, how come she's where she is now and how come she's doing the things that she's doing? And I want to tell you this, and this is why I entitled this. I'm not going to talk about dyspraxia and the, I think you've covered this, Serena. I was going to talk a little bit about some of the symptoms that I had. And you can see some of the type, what people call children with dyspraxia. They have learning difficulties, they're clumsy, etc. And you can have sensory integration, which includes the autism that we spoke about earlier. And for me, I would say the processing of sensory information was the difficult thing. And what they say when the child has sensory integration or dyspraxia is that you're experiencing what is called a neurological traffic jam. So processing information in your head is not the same as what other people might do. So children with sensory integration do not have intellectual impairment, but they struggle to put what they see, what they feel, what they touch, what they hear together in the brain so that it makes sense in the normal way. And of course, this can cause anxiety. Now, this is my last slide. And if you see, you can see myself there. I don't know if you can see me in there. This is a picture of me probably in A-level. Years later, I was the captain of the hockey team, vice captain of the hockey team. I done so many other things between 5th grade and this time in my life. And of course, I've since gone on to do other things. And what was the difference? And I wrote down some points here that which might help you when you have children that have some of these challenges and issues. One, nobody placed any limits on me. Nobody, even though the teachers tried to label me, they did that because of my academic experience that I'd had in 4th grade. But in my home, at home, nobody actually ever said I had anything. Even the allergies that I had, nobody labeled them. Nobody said, oh, she's like this, or she's this way, or she's that way. I didn't have that. And because I didn't have that, what I went on to do for the rest of my life was try everything and anything. I had, and I probably still, for those of you that don't know me, I had no sense of cannot do. I didn't have that. If you ask me to do something like today, if you ask me to do something, I'll be like, okay, sure, I'll do it. And I had that adventurous spirit. I had that idea that, you know what, if there's something to be done, if there's something to be played, I want to sing, I want to dance, I want to play that sport. I looked at kids playing hockey one day and I said, I'm going to play that sport. And I picked up a hockey stick and I tried it and it worked. And I was able to do it. What I know now as an occupational therapist, and I always say that my career as an occupational therapist was ordered by God. When I went to uni and I was studying occupational therapy and trying to understand, and we were learning about sensory integration and all these things, it just, the light bulb went on. I said, oh, this was what was wrong with me. This is what challenged me. These were the challenges that I had. And when I also learned what occupational therapists do to help children with sensory integration issues, dyspraxia, and all sorts of other neurological issues, I realized that by me living life and by me not being given limits to what I could and could not do, I had actually basically treated myself. I had lived, and what occupational therapists do is that we treat and help people with different conditions through the art of living. We use different activities, normal activities, play activities for children, and different types of of experiences to help the body, the mind to regain its function and for the person to live independently. So all those years when I was playing sport, when I was trying whatever I could, when I was falling and tripping, when people threw balls at me and they fell out of my hands and people called me names and I still carried on doing what I needed to do, I was doing therapy on myself. And as time went on, some of those things became less and less prominent. And as Serena said, that there is progress, because sometimes we look at children and we think, well, they're always going to be like this. They're not. They don't necessarily always have to be like that. So there is progress that can be made. I made significant progress. Now, I may still have some struggles, but I know that most of the challenges that I had as a child, I went on to play netball, I went on to play hockey professionally and all those things, because I didn't have a sense that I could not. And this is what I want to encourage you as parents, that whatever the challenges the children in our care may have, that let us not give them the labels, even if you do get a diagnosis that says this person is autistic or that they have this and that challenge. What I do encourage, because there's always hope, and we also know now that the brain has plasticity, as we call it, right? And that plasticity of the brain allows the individual to be able to experience new experiences, for the brain to reshape, change, transform, so that the person can do more things, different things, and also experience life in a better way, as long as they're given those opportunities. Now, I'm going to go back to my 5th grade story. Me finding myself in this class where everybody had a learning disability, and I was there, and I thought to myself, I don't belong here. Let me tell you what I did. This is a funny story. I decided that I was going to move from that class. I didn't tell anyone. I asked my cousin, who was in the same stream as myself, I said, what class are you in? And she said, oh, I'm in 5C. So I said, okay, I think I'll find myself to 5C. Maybe after 3 days in that class, and having scoped out what was going on, and I realized that this is not where I wanted to be. So I sneaked into 5C and sat at the back. And I did this for nearly a week. You know, in class, as Serena is a teacher, they read out the register. So they're calling out the register, so-and-so, Mary, John, Henry. Those are real names, by the way. There was a boy in my class called Henry, who I still remember because he was very, very mischievous. But they would call out these names, and I never raised my hand for any name. And at the end of the week, the class teacher said, "And you, what's your name?" I said, I shy and timidly raised my hand. I said, Edith. And she said, oh, how come you're in this class? And I said, because I think I belong here. And she said, why do you say so? I said, because my cousin's here. Now, I gave a lame excuse, right? I should have. Ultimately, what I thought and believed was that I didn't belong in that other class. I belonged here. This was my aptitude, and I was able to do that. But of course, I wasn't bold enough to do that. So I told the teacher that I belonged here and not where I was. So she just kept quiet and did nothing, added my name to the list. And I stayed in that class. I worked hard. I experienced new experiences. I experienced more challenging experiences, more than what I would have had I stayed in 5E. I experienced more learning than when I stayed in the other class. I was able to grow intellectually while being challenged to read more intellectual stuff, to experience more intellectual things in mathematics. And at the end of that year, in 1984, I was top of that class. And the following year, they moved me to the 6A, the first stream. And then as they say, the rest is history. Now, I kicked myself when afterwards I was like, Edith, you should have moved yourself to 6A. Why did you move to 5A? Why did you put yourself in 5C? Because I still limited myself. Now, I want to encourage all of us, adults. You may have challenges. You may still experience whatever sensory challenges you have, maybe even learning challenges that you may have, whether it's ADHD, because we know it still exists in adults, whether you're on what we call the autistic spectrum, maybe you have clumsiness, you're still an adult who's considered clumsy. I want to recommend to you that there are no limits, as someone said. There are no limits, Brian Tracy, to what we can accomplish except the limits that we place on our own thinking. And I want to suggest that even for our children, as we work with them, whether in the school setting or you are working with them in your home, as you partner with them in their growing and partner with God in helping your children to become the adults they're meant to be and what they're meant to accomplish in life, where they're meant to go. Who would have thought if I had stayed in that class, I would not be here today? I can promise you that. If I had stayed in that class, but God put an instinct in me to move myself from that limiting environment and to experience more in life. And I want to suggest that all of us here can do that, even right now, but also our children need to be given the opportunity to grow. We need to take note of the social circumstances that they're learning in, whether it's we are imposing those circumstances on them, not giving them the right environment to be nourished in and to learn and to grow. And maybe it's the culture around us. And we need to give our children the best environment and not set limits on them. Let them explore life, do life. Don't label them with things that they may have to carry for the rest of their lives as burdens, and don't place limits on what is possible. And I think life has shown us that. Stephen Hawking, other people like that, whatever challenges we may have, whether physical in nature, mental in nature, there is no limit to what we're able and we're capable of achieving, as long as we're given opportunities and the place and the environment to grow, and we're nourished in the right way. So I want to end here and just hope that this gives you hope, whether it's for you or for your children, that you can go away knowing that it's possible and your children can be whatever it is that they want to be with the right input. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Serena and Edith, for that very thought-provoking discussion and presentation this evening. It's quite a deep subject. It's quite a lot to it. Before I offer my reflections, we have a number or a couple of questions in the chat. I think the first one is, ADHD autism hereditary?
It can run in families. Yeah, it can, but not absolute, but they can run in families.
Okay, thank you. And then another question from Anna in Norwich. She asks, how can we communicate with an autistic child that after doing one mistake, shouts, hides him, after one mistake, he hides, shouts himself in a corner behind the door and bangs his head repeatedly, or when he refuses to engage in a learning activity that he does not want to do because he does not like it?
Mm-hmm.
We have a reflection from our panelists, please.
I don't know, Edith, if you've ever worked with the zones of regulation, whereby it's a system that you get the child to be able to identify how they're feeling. It's color coded. So, for example, green would be the optimal color. Yellow is when they sense themselves maybe starting to be a bit silly, a bit hyperactive, or feeling that they're getting a bit out of control. Red being ultimately out of control, and that's where you're at meltdown stage. And then blue at the opposite end being when you're very calm. So I would say engage that child when they're in the green and begin to introduce them to the zones of regulation, and using social stories, identify with them. These are the times when you feel calm and in the green zone. What sort of things are you doing? What are the triggers that you end up in the red zone? Explain, work with them. Banging your head is not an activity that's going to keep you safe, and there are consequences to that you could injure yourself and then ultimately end up in hospital. And that might not be a very nice experience, where then you might have to be poked and prodded. Just be honest with them about what the consequences are, and then think, well, let's see if we can find an alternative for you to release your frustrations, because we can't get rid of the frustration you feel at having made a mistake. We understand that making mistakes does cause you anxiety, but we need to find a safe way for you to be able to express your frustration. And also, I think he might need some work around the anxiety in terms of, so that he can learn to understand that although to him it's the end of the world, that it's not the end of the world. but that will take some time and maybe some input from like CAM's team or clinical psychologists to help him to be able to, put things in perspective about whether that ultimately is the worst thing that could ever happen. What will happen if you make a mistake? It's okay to make mistakes. Mistakes are permissible, and we can always learn and, try and work with him to look at the progress that he is making. Does that help? I can send you more information after if you send your email.
Thank you, Serena. Anna, is there anything else you wanted to add to that?
Well, we use zone of regulation, so the regulation meetings already, and they work when he gets frustrated, because we can leave him doing some